In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. And then, if you survive it long enough, they offer you something worse. A reward. A paradise world. Green fields, warm air, flowers that smell like everything you've been missing for 31 years. And you hate it immediately, because nothing that looks this right has ever been right. Hey, I'm your brother from the Void, and this is Tales from the Void. Today's story is about a man named Culvin, retired sergeant, 31 years in the Imperial Guard, more scars than memories worth keeping. The Imperium gave him a commendation with a wax seal that smelled expensive, a shuttle ride smoother than anything he'd ever known, and settlement rights on a world called Valundris, where the air tastes like flowers and warm rain. The gardens are designed like machines that produce tranquility, and the food is the most beautiful thing he has ever put in his mouth. And something flickers between the trees when he isn't looking directly at it, and the laughter from the forest has too many notes for a human throat, and the quiet, that perfect, unbroken quiet, is the quiet of a world that has never screamed. If they ever offer you paradise, listen to this first. Settle in. This is Tales from the Void. Let's begin. The first thing that will kill you on a paradise world is the quiet, not the silence of a dead city after orbital bombardment. I knew that silence. I had lived inside it for 30 years, breathed it between the detonations, let it fill the spaces where the screams had been. On Meridax, after the Orc siege broke the outer hab blocks, there was a kind of silence that settled over the rubble like ash. You could hear the cooling metal tick. You could hear the distant groan of structures that had not yet decided whether to stand or fall. That silence had a rhythm to it. It was the silence of a thing that had been loud and was catching its breath before being loud again. I understood that silence. I had a relationship with it. This was different. This was the silence of a world that had never screamed. And I have learned, too late, that a world that has never screamed is not a peaceful world. It is a world that is holding its breath. My name is Culvin, Sergeant, retired, Gravean 47th Armored Infantry, 3rd Battalion, Chimera Company. I served 31 years in the Imperial Guard, which is about 28 years longer than the actuarial tables said I should have. The Departamento Munitorum does not like it when you outlive your projected mortality window. It confuses their paperwork. And the Munitorum, for all its countless failings, does not enjoy confusion. So, when a soldier like me somehow claws his way through 3 decades of the Emperor's wars without having the decency to die, they have to do something with him. They cannot simply discharge you. That would imply the Imperium has no further use for you, and the Imperium always has a use for you, even if that use is rotting quietly on a world where they never have to think about you again. They told me it was a reward, a commendation. The Lord General himself signed the transit papers, or at least someone with a convincing facsimile of his seal did. Sergeant Culvin, in recognition of distinguished and exemplary service to the Golden Throne, is hereby granted settlement rights on the paradise world of Valundris, Segmentum Tempestus, effective immediately. There was a wax seal on the document. It smelled like something expensive. I had not smelled anything expensive in 3 decades. The shuttle down was the smoothest atmospheric entry I had ever experienced. I want you to understand what that means. I had done dozens of combat drops. I had ridden Valkyries through anti-aircraft fire so thick the air turned into a wall of shrapnel and burning fuel. I had been inside a chimera that was dropped from a bulk hauler because the landing zone was too hot for the transport to touch down, and we hit the ground hard enough to rupture the fuel line and crack 3 of my ribs. Every atmospheric entry I had ever known was a violent thing. The ship fighting the air fighting back, the passengers inside bouncing off the walls and each other like ammunition in a dropped magazine. You learn to clench your jaw so you would not bite through your tongue, and you learn to breathe in short, controlled bursts so the shaking would not knock the wind out of you. The shuttle to Velundris did none of that. It descended like a leaf settling on still water. The hull did not rattle. The engines did not scream. There was a faint hum, almost musical, and through the viewport I watched the clouds part like curtains being drawn back from a window, and beneath them was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in my life, and I hated it immediately. Green. Unbroken, impossible, defiant green, stretching to every horizon. Not the sickly yellow green of irradiated marshland, not the dark mottled green of jungle canopy that hid orc warband camps and tyrannid spore clusters, not the chemical-stained green of industrial runoff pooling in the gutters of Gravayen's lower habs. This was green the way green was supposed to be, if you believed the old Pict captures in the Schola textbooks. Living green. Healthy green. Green that meant nothing was wrong. I did not trust it. I had not trusted anything that looked right since Hedricon 4, when a perfectly intact Hab block turned out to be full of orc commandos who had learned to stay quiet long enough for our forward scouts to walk past them. 14 men walked into that building. I was one of the 3 who walked out. The spaceport, if you could call it that, was a single landing platform made of polished white stone set into a hillside. Not rockcrete. Stone. Actual quarried stone, cut and fitted by hand, or at least by something that was designed to look like it had been done by hand. There were no blast shields, no fuel depots, no ammunition caches, no anti-aircraft batteries. There was not even a proper control tower. Instead, there was a small pavilion with a domed roof covered in climbing flowers, and beneath it stood a single figure in a white robe, who smiled at me as the shuttle's ramp descended. The air hit me first. It always does, on a new world. 31 years of deployments had taught me to read a planet by its atmosphere the way a tech priest reads a cogitator's machine spirit. The air on Gravayen tasted like metal and recycled moisture, and the faint chemical bite of industrial filtration. The air on Meridax tasted like dust and blood and cordite. The air on Hedricon 4 tasted like nothing at all, because the orcs had burned so much of the vegetation that the atmosphere had thinned to the point where every breath felt like you were drinking through a straw. The air on Velundris tasted like flowers and warm rain and something sweet I could not name. It was the kind of air that made you want to breathe deeper. It was the kind of air that made your shoulders drop and your hands unclench and the knot between your shoulder blades loosen by a fraction. And that was the moment I knew something was wrong, because my body had not done any of those things voluntarily in 30 years. And the fact that this planet could make it happen in the space of a single breath meant that Velundris was doing something to me, and I did not like things that did things to me without my permission. The woman in the white robe introduced herself as Paleth. A liaison, she said, an attendant assigned to ease my transition from active service to resettlement. She had a soft voice and soft hands and soft eyes, and everything about her was so aggressively soft that I wanted to check her for concealed weapons on principle. She did not carry herself like someone who had ever been in danger. Her posture was relaxed in a way that was not laziness but genuine comfort, the posture of a person who had never needed to calculate the distance to the nearest piece of cover. She walked me along a path of white stone, winding through gardens that seemed to have been designed by someone who had studied the concept of beauty with the same obsessive precision that the Adeptus Mechanicus applied to the study of plasma containment fields. Every tree was positioned to frame a view. Every flower bed was arranged to lead the eye toward the next curve in the path. Every bench, every fountain, every ornamental arch was placed with such deliberate care that the overall effect was not of a garden, but of a machine that produced tranquility the way a Lehman Russ produced death, systematically and without waste. As we walked, something moved at the edge of my vision. Fast, too fast. A flicker of motion between the trees to our left, there and gone in less than a heartbeat, the way a bolt flickers at the edge of your peripheral sight during a night engagement. I stopped. I turned. There was nothing. Just the trees and the dappled light, and the gentle sway of branches in a breeze that smelled of something I could not name. "A bird," Paleth said, following my gaze with an easy smile. "We have the most remarkable species here. Some of them move so quickly they appear as shadows." I nodded. I did not believe her. I had spent a lifetime distinguishing between things that moved like animals and things that moved like threats, and whatever I had seen moved like a threat. But I had no frame of reference. I was on a new world. The fauna was unfamiliar. It could have been a bird. It could have been anything. I let it go. That was my first mistake. Paleth told me about Valundris as we walked. A paradise world in the truest sense, she said. One of fewer than 30 such worlds officially classified in the Imperium. Low population, no heavy industry, no military installations, no tithe obligations beyond a modest cultural contribution to the subsector's administrative archives. The climate was regulated by ancient atmospheric processors buried deep beneath the planet's crust, relics of a previous age that the Adeptus Mechanicus had declared sacred and inviolable. The result was perpetual mild seasons, gentle rains that came and went with the regularity of a chronometer, and skies that shifted between shades of amber and rose during the long, slow sunsets that Valundris was apparently famous for. She told me about the other residents, retired officers mostly, administratum functionaries who had completed their service terms, ecclesiarchy officials who had been rewarded for decades of faithful ministry. A handful of veterans like me, though she was vague about their numbers and their names. The population of the planet was small, fewer than 100,000, she said, spread across 3 inhabited continents. Most lived in the capital, Velithos Reach, a city that was less a city and more a series of interconnected estates built into and around the planet's dramatic coastal cliffs. She told me about my estate, a modest property, she called it, though her definition of modest and mine were separated by approximately 3 decades of sleeping in trenches, burned-out buildings, and the back compartments of armored vehicles. The estate consisted of a main house with 7 rooms, a separate bathhouse, a garden that wrapped around 3 sides of the property, and a staff of 4 servants who would attend to my needs. The servants came with the property. They were part of the world service caste, she explained, individuals born and raised on Valundris, whose families had served the estates for generations. I asked her what the catch was. She smiled at me the way you smile at a child who has asked a question that is both charming and slightly sad. "There is no catch, Sergeant Melak," she said. "You have earned this. The Emperor rewards those who serve." The estate was as described. The main house was built from white stone with high arched windows that let in the light and the breeze in equal measure. The furniture was solid, dark wood, polished to a shine that would have made a commissaire weep with satisfaction. The bed in the main sleeping chamber was wider than the crew compartment of a chimera, and when I pressed my hand into the mattress, my fingers sank to the second knuckle. The servants were waiting. 2 women and 2 men, all of them young, all of them dressed in simple, clean clothing, all of them smiling. Their names were Emdra, Sullus, Culvin, and Reth. They bowed when I entered, not the sharp, fearful bow of a subordinate who has learned that authority means pain, but the slow, measured bow of people who had been trained to serve and took a quiet pride in it. They moved around the house like water, appearing when I needed something and disappearing when I did not, always present but never intrusive. I ate my first meal on Velundris at a table set with actual porcelain. The food was unlike anything I had eaten in 3 decades. Fresh meat, not corpse starch or reconstituted protein blocks. Fresh vegetables with actual color and texture and taste. Bread that was soft and warm. Fruit that I could not name, sweet and sharp at the same time, with juice that ran down my chin. And the sauce. A thick amber sauce with a taste of herbs that I had never encountered. Warm and complex, that Emdra drizzled over the meat and the vegetables, and even the bread with the careful attention of an apothecary measuring a dose. I ate all of it, and then I sat at that table and I listened to the silence, and the silence pressed against the windows and seeped through the walls and filled the rooms, and there were no engines and no artillery and no vox chatter and no distant crack of lass fire. Just the wind in the trees and the distant sound of water, and the world was quiet in a way that made my teeth ache. I did not sleep that night. I sat in the dark in a comfortable chair and I watched the door, because that was what you did. You watched the door. You waited for it to open, and when it did, you were ready. It did not open. But I watched anyway because 3 decades of combat had made watching as natural as breathing, and the absence of an enemy did not mean the absence of a threat. It meant the threat was better hidden. Some time past the 2nd hour, I heard laughter, not from inside the house, from outside, from the direction of the forest beyond the garden. It was faint, musical, and wrong. Not the laughter of a human voice. Something higher, something with more notes in it than a human throat could produce, a cascading, crystalline sound that rose and fell and rose again, like water over stones. It lasted perhaps 3 seconds, and then it stopped and the silence returned, and the silence was heavier than before, as though it was pressing down on the place where the laughter had been, trying to cover it. In the morning, I asked Emdra about the sound. "Night birds," she said without hesitation. "Some of the species here have calls that sound almost like voices. It is quite beautiful when you grow accustomed to it." I did not grow accustomed to it. I heard it again on the 3rd night, and the 5th, and the 7th. Always from the forest, always brief. Always that same cascading, inhuman quality. And each time it was closer. The first week was hard for reasons beyond the laughter and the silence. It was the absence of structure. For 3 decades, every moment of my day had been dictated by someone else. Wake at this hour, eat at this hour, march at this hour, shoot at this hour. The regiment was a machine and I was a component, and components do not need to decide what to do with themselves because their function is determined by their position in the mechanism. Remove the component from the machine and it does not suddenly become free. It becomes useless. It sits on a workbench gathering dust, shaped for a purpose it can no longer perform. That was me on Velundris. I woke at the same time every morning because my body refused to understand that there was no longer a reveille to answer. I dressed in civilian clothes that felt wrong against skin, accustomed to flak armor. I ate the breakfast Emdra prepared. And then I stood in my garden and tried to think of a single thing to do with the hours that stretched ahead of me, like an open plain with no cover and no objective. The first week passed, and then the second, and something began to change, and the change was so gradual that I almost missed it. My knee stopped hurting. I need to explain what that means. My left knee had been damaged on Meridax 15 years into my service. A piece of shrapnel from an orc stick bomb had shattered the patella and torn through the cartilage, and the field Medici had rebuilt it with pins and synthetic tissue that functioned well enough for me to walk and run and fight, but never well enough for me to forget that it had been broken. The pain was constant, not severe. A dull, grinding ache that flared when the pressure changed, or when I crouched for too long, or when the cold got into the joint. It had been with me for 16 years. It was part of how I experienced the world. When I woke in the morning, the first thing I felt was the knee, and when I went to sleep at night, the last thing I noticed was the knee, and every moment in between it was there, a low signal in the background noise of my body, reminding me that I had been damaged and that the damage was permanent. On the 12th day on Velundris, I woke up and the signal was gone. I lay in bed for several minutes, confused, waiting for the pain to arrive, the way you wait for a sound that you expect to hear, but that does not come. It did not come. I bent the knee. I extended it. I pressed on the joint with my fingers, probing for the familiar hot spot where the pins sat beneath the skin. Nothing. No pain, no ache, no grinding. The knee moved smoothly, easily, as though the shrapnel had never found it. I told myself it was the rest. 16 years of constant stress on the joint, and now, for the first time, it was being allowed to heal. Proper food, clean air, a comfortable bed. The body is a machine, and machines recover when the load is removed. This was a reasonable explanation. I am a practical man. I preferred reasonable explanations. But then the burn scar began to fade. The scar from the orc flamer had been a permanent feature of my torso since Hedricon 4. A long, ridged band of tissue that ran from my left hip to my right shoulder, tight and shiny and numb in some places, and painfully sensitive in others. The Medici who treated me had told me it would never fully heal. The damage was too deep. The tissue had been cooked, not just burned, and cooked tissue does not regenerate. It scars, it stays, it becomes part of you. By the end of my 3rd week on Velundris, the scar was lighter. The ridges were lower. The tight, pulling sensation that accompanied every deep breath, a sensation I had lived with for 12 years, was diminishing. The skin was softening, growing new, as though the burn had never happened. I stood in front of the mirror in my bathhouse and I looked at my body, and I catalogued the changes with the clinical detachment of a quartermaster conducting an inventory. The knee, the burn scar, the stiffness in my right shoulder from the dislocation on Vareth Prime, the persistent ringing in my left ear from a demolition charge that had detonated too close. All of it was fading. All of it was getting better. Not just stabilizing, improving, reversing. My body was moving backward through its own history of damage, as though time was running in the wrong direction, as though the years of war were being peeled away layer by layer. And I felt good. That was the thing that frightened me most. I felt good. Not just the absence of pain, although that alone was extraordinary after 16 years of grinding discomfort. I felt strong, alert but calm, rested. The nightmares had not stopped, but they had softened, their edges worn down like stones in a river, their images blurred, their emotional charge muted. I could remember them in the morning, but they did not linger. They did not follow me through the day the way they had on every other world. The war was receding. The constant, low-level hypervigilance that had kept me alive for 3 decades was relaxing, not disappearing, but dimming, like a lamp being slowly turned down. And I thought, for a brief, terrifying moment, that maybe this was real. Maybe this was what healing looked like. Maybe this was what happened when a broken man was placed in a safe environment with good food and clean air and peace. Real peace, not the false peace of an operational pause, but actual, genuine, permanent peace. I wanted to believe it. Emperor, help me, I wanted to believe it. And for 3 days I did. 3 days where I did not watch the door at night. 3 days where I ate my meals without analyzing them, walked in the garden without scanning for threats, sat in my chair in the evening and listened to the wind in the trees, and felt nothing but the simple, devastating pleasure of not being afraid. The knee did not hurt, the shoulder did not ache, the burn did not pull. For the first time in 16 years, I could take a full breath without feeling the scar tissue tighten across my ribs. And the breath was clean and deep, and it filled me with something that I had forgotten existed. I thought, maybe this is what the Emperor intended. Not the war, not the dying. Maybe the war was the means and this was the end, and I had simply never lived long enough to reach it. Maybe the paranoia was not instinct. Maybe it was damage. Maybe the constant grinding suspicion that had kept me alive for 3 decades was not a tool, but a wound. And this world, this beautiful, gentle, patient world, was doing what no medici and no field chaplain and no amount of recaf and counteragents had ever managed to do. It was healing the part of me that the shrapnel and the flamers could not reach. I almost stayed in that thought. I almost let it close over me like water over a stone. 3 days of peace after 31 years of war, and the peace was winning, and the soldier was drowning, and the drowning felt like rest. And then, on the morning of my 24th day on Velundris, I found the thorn. It was on the path between my garden and the tree line, lying in the grass as though it had fallen from a branch. But there were no thorny plants nearby. The garden was maintained with meticulous care, and the nearest forest growth was several meters away. The thorn itself was wrong. It was the length of my little finger, thin as a needle, and it was black. Not dark brown or dark gray, the way natural thorns tend to be, but black, a depthless, light-absorbing black that made it look like a hole in the grass rather than an object lying on it. When I picked it up, it weighed almost nothing. It was so light that I could barely feel it between my fingers, and it was sharp. I tested it carefully against the pad of my thumb, and it drew blood instantly, a clean, precise cut that stung with a heat that was disproportionate to its size. I put the thorn in my pocket. I asked Emdra about it at breakfast. She looked at it briefly and told me it was from a velith bush, a native species that grew in the deeper parts of the forest. They shed their thorns seasonally, nothing to worry about. I did not throw the thorn away, I kept it. And I noticed that the cut on my thumb, tiny as it was, did not heal the way cuts on Velundris had been healing. It stayed open. It stung. It was still there 2 days later, a small red line on my thumb, stubbornly refusing to close, while the rest of my body continued its miraculous renovation around it. I began to pay closer attention to the food, not obviously. I continued to eat everything Emdra prepared, continued to compliment it, continued to display the grateful appetite of a man who had spent 3 decades eating corpse starch and was overwhelmed by real cuisine. But I watched. I watched Emdra in the kitchen, noted the ingredients she used, the sauces she prepared, the locked cabinet she opened each morning with a small key that she wore around her neck, and that contained the dried herbs and powdered roots that went into virtually every dish. The sauce, particularly. The amber sauce that accompanied every meal, warm and herbal and faintly sweet. She made it fresh each day from ingredients in the locked cabinet, and she applied it to everything, and every meal that contained it left me feeling warm and calm and rested, and gradually, incrementally, unmistakably less like myself. I did not stop eating it. Not yet. Because stopping would mean acknowledging what I suspected, and acknowledging what I suspected would mean making a decision. And the decision was not a simple one. If the food was doing what I thought it was doing, if it was the reason my scars were fading, and my pain was receding, and my nightmares were softening, then stopping meant choosing to go back. Back to the pain. Back to the sleepless nights. Back to the grinding, relentless vigilance that had kept me alive, but had also, I could now admit with the clarity that the food itself provided, been slowly destroying me from the inside out. That was the trap within the trap. Not just sedation. Healing. Genuine, measurable, physical healing, bound up with the sedation in a package that made them inseparable. You could not have the relief without the compliance. You could not keep the healed knee and reject the dulled instincts. It was all one thing. And the choice, when you understood it, was not between truth and comfort. It was between being whole and broken and awake, or repaired and diminished and asleep. I met the other veterans at the end of my 4th week. There were 11 of us on Velundris, scattered across the northern continent in estates similar to mine. The first 3 I encountered were at a social gathering in Velathos Reach, a reception hosted by the Lord Governor's cultural attaché in a marble hall overlooking the sea. Lieutenant Draven Osek, formerly of the Prothean 9th Dragoons, Captain Mola Fentris, formerly of the Vastilan Drop Troops, Warrant Officer Gerard Tolvain, formerly of the Bakon 7th Heavy Infantry. Each had served at least 20 years, each bore the marks of service, and each had been on Velundris for at least 3 years. It took me less than an hour to realize that something had been done to them. Not in the crude, obvious way I had initially expected. It was worse than that. They had not been broken. They had been repaired. Their scars, like mine, had faded. Their old injuries had healed. The persistent damage of decades of warfare had been gently, carefully, lovingly reversed, and with it had gone the instincts, the vigilance, the hardwired suspicion that combat builds into a human being the way pressure builds carbon into diamond. They were soft, not weak, not stupid, not incapable, soft. The hardness had been drawn out of them like venom from a wound. Osek told me about his garden. He had planted an orchard of a local fruit tree, and he described the process of cultivation with a focused enthusiasm that I recognized because I had seen it before, in men who had been reassigned to non-combat duties and who threw themselves into inconsequential tasks with a desperate intensity that was really just the momentum of 30 years of purposeful activity searching for a new channel. He was filling time, but he did not know he was filling time. He thought he was living. Fentris was painting, with brushes, on canvas. She showed me a series of landscapes she had completed, views of the coast and the forests and the sunsets, rendered in careful, precise detail that spoke of long hours of patient observation. They were good. She had talent. And when I looked at her while she described her technique, I saw something that disturbed me more than anything I had seen on Velundris so far. I saw peace. Genuine peace. Not the performance of peace. Not the mask of peace that soldiers wear when they are trying to convince themselves and others that they are adjusting. Real peace. The kind of peace that a person has when they have stopped fighting, all the way down. When the war inside has gone quiet along with the war outside. I asked about defenses, the absence of a planetary defense force, the fact that this world had no orbital guns, no shield generators, no standing military of any kind beyond a small ceremonial guard that wore gilded carapace armor and carried weapons that had clearly never been fired. They gave me the answer I would hear again and again on Velundris, delivered with the patient smile of people who had heard the question before and found it endearing. "There is no need for defenses here," Osek said. "Velundris is protected by its obscurity. We are safe. We have always been safe." I pushed. I mentioned the laughter I had heard in the forest at night. I mentioned the shadow I had seen on my first day. I mentioned the thorn. Fentress looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as maternal, which was remarkable for a woman who had once led a combat drop into a tyrannid-infested refinery and pulled 3 wounded troopers out of a collapsing structure, while hormagaunts clawed at her legs. "Sergeant Melak," she said, "it takes time. The adjustment is difficult. I remember how I felt in the first weeks. Everything seems threatening because everything has been threatening for so long. But it passes. The peace becomes real. You learn to trust it." And her voice was so gentle and so certain and so completely devoid of doubt that I felt something cold settle in my stomach. I left the reception early. On the walk back along the coastal road, I found another thorn. This one was longer than the first, nearly the length of my hand, and it was lying on the white stone of the path as though it had been placed there deliberately. I picked it up. The same impossible black, the same negligible weight, the same disproportionate sharpness. I held it up against the sunset, that perpetual voluptuous sunset of amber and coral and deep rose, and the thorn did not catch the light. It absorbed it. It was a sliver of darkness held against a sky made of faint, and looking at it made my eyes water, not from the brightness but from some quality of the thorn itself, something about the way it existed in the space it occupied that my human vision was not designed to process. I put it in my pocket with the first one. I now had 2 fragments of something that did not belong on this world, and I did not yet know what they were. But I knew what they were not. They were not from a native plant. The test came on my 30th day. I woke before dawn and I did not eat breakfast. I drank water from the bathhouse tap, which drew from a gravity-fed supply outside the servant's control, and I told Emdra I was fasting for devotional reasons, a plausible excuse on any Imperial world. She did not argue, but her hands tightened around the dish she was carrying, and her smile became fixed in a way that told me she was unhappy. By midday, the fog began to lift. Not a physical fog, the cognitive fog that I had not realized was there until it started to thin, the way you do not realize you are hearing a background hum until the machine producing it shuts off. My thoughts sharpened. My perceptions narrowed and intensified. The world around me, which had been soft and warm and gently blurred at the edges for weeks, snapped into focus with a clarity that was almost painful. And with the clarity came the pain, the knee. Not as bad as it had been, the healing was apparently not entirely dependent on continuous doses, but present, a dull throb that returned like an old friend who does not know he is unwelcome. The shoulder, the ear, the tightness of the burn scar, partially faded but now reasserting itself, and the hypervigilance, the old familiar, essential vigilance, the state of mind that reads every room for exits, every face for threat, every silence for what is hiding inside it. It came back like a tide, and with it came the certain absolute knowledge that I was right, that this world was wrong, that the food was drugged, that the healing was a leash, and that every veteran on this planet was being kept in a state of contented oblivion by a substance in their meals that they consumed 3 times a day because it was served to them by smiling servants in beautiful houses on the most peaceful world they had ever known. I ate the evening meal. I needed to maintain the cover, but I ate less. I drank more water, and I began to plan. My first theory was Slaanesh. It was the obvious conclusion. A paradise world steeped in hedonism, where the population was kept in a state of perpetual sensory pleasure, where the food produced euphoria, where the art and the music and the architecture were all designed to maximize aesthetic stimulation. I had seen the briefing materials on Slaaneshi cults. I knew the signs. A world that worshipped sensation above duty. A governing class that encouraged indulgence over discipline. the slow, insidious replacement of Imperial faith with something softer and sweeter and infinitely more corrosive. It fitted. The food was a sacrament. The ceremonies were rituals. The governor was a cult leader draped in the Emperor's colors. It fitted so well that I was almost certain. I was wrong. The Slaanesh theory broke when I examined the details. Slaanesh cults escalate. They begin with pleasure and they end with depravity, each generation pushing further than the last, chasing sensations that become harder to achieve and more extreme to provide. Valundris was not escalating. Valundris was stable. The same routines, the same food, the same gentle, measured contentment, sustained at the same level for what appeared to be generations. A Slaanesh cult would have burned through this world's innocence in a decade. Something was maintaining the equilibrium, something external. My second theory was genes stealers, the pattern of disappearances, the compliant population, the drugged food, the secretive governor maintaining a system that fed people into a hidden mechanism. I had read the after-action reports from Ulthar Secundus, where a genes stealer cult had operated for 3 generations inside a mining colony, using chemical agents in the water supply to suppress suspicion, while the Patriarch built its brood in the deep tunnels. The similarities were uncomfortable. The locked cabinet, the servants who knew more than they said, the forbidden forest that no one was allowed to enter. A genes stealer patriarch could be nesting in those trees, its psychic influence radiating outward, its cult maintaining the supply of fresh hosts through the ceremonies that the population celebrated without question. I was wrong about that too, but I did not know it yet. Not until I went into the forest and found the carvings, and the carvings were not the bulbous, organic forms of genes stealer iconography, but something older and sharper and infinitely more cruel. Not chaos, not tyrannid, something else entirely. 2 days after my fast, I witnessed the ceremony. It happened in the gardens of Velithos Reach, in a wide amphitheater of sculpted hedges and flowering trees that overlooked the bay. Paleth had invited me. She called it the Rite of the Verdant Path, a monthly observance in which the community gathered to honor those who had been chosen for what she described as a pilgrimage to the deep gardens. I almost did not go, but my instincts, newly resharpened, told me that anything the world's social structure made a point of celebrating was something I needed to see. There were perhaps 300 people in the amphitheater, residents and servants both, dressed in white and green, seated on stone benches that curved in concentric semicircles around a central platform. The atmosphere was festive. People talked and laughed and shared food from communal platters. Children ran between the benches. Musicians played instruments I did not recognize, producing a sweet, flowing music that wound through the crowd like perfume. On the central platform stood a single figure, a young woman from the service caste, dressed in robes of deep green embroidered with golden thread. She faced the crowd and she was smiling. Not the fixed, vacant smile of the drugged. A genuine smile, a proud smile, the smile of a person who believed she had been chosen for something wonderful. The Lord Governor's steward, a thin, precise man named Urith Callis, addressed the crowd from the platform. He spoke of the deep gardens, a place of profound spiritual significance, a sanctuary hidden within the ancient forests of Valundris, where the faithful could commune with the Emperor's grace in its purest form. He spoke of the honor of being chosen. He spoke of the joy that the pilgrims would find there. He spoke for 10 minutes, and every word was a lie, and the 300 people in the amphitheater listened and nodded and smiled because the food they had eaten that morning had made them incapable of hearing the lie beneath the words. The crowd applauded. They threw flowers. They sang a hymn that sounded like every other Imperial hymn I had ever heard, full of gratitude and devotion and the unshakable conviction that the Emperor's plan, however mysterious, was fundamentally good. and the chosen pilgrim walked off the platform and down a path that led toward the forest, still smiling, still proud, and the crowd watched her go and then return to their food and their conversation and their beautiful, poisoned lives. I was the only person in that amphitheater who understood what I had just seen. I was the only one who knew that this woman was not going on a pilgrimage. She was going to a clearing in the deep forest where a gate stood open to a city of torment, and she was going to walk through it, and she was never coming back. And the smile on her face was the product of a chemical in her food that had been designed by alien flesh crafters to ensure that the livestock went to slaughter without fuss. I did not make a sound. I did not react. I sat on my stone bench and I watched the musicians play, and I felt the heat of something building in my chest that was not grief and was not rage, but was something older than both. Something that had been there since the first time I had watched good people die for reasons they did not understand and could not have prevented. I went to see Culvin that evening. Of my 4 servants, Culvin was the one I had watched most closely. He was the youngest, perhaps 25, and he handled the outdoor maintenance, the garden, the grounds, the small repairs. He was quiet and diligent and unremarkable in every way, except for one thing. Each evening, at precisely the same time, Culvin walked to the edge of the garden where the cultivated grounds met the tree line of the forest beyond. He stood there for exactly 1 minute. He looked into the trees, and then he came back. He had done this every day since I arrived, and on the night of the ceremony, when I found him at his spot at the tree line, his face was wet with tears. I did not ease into it. I did not ask careful questions. I told him what I knew. I told him the food was drugged. I told him the ceremony was a lie. I told him the pilgrims were not coming back. And I watched his face as I said each thing, and I watched the careful composure crack, and I watched the truth emerge from beneath it like a body rising from shallow water. He did not deny it. He could not. The tears had already betrayed him. But what he told me was worse than what I had expected, because what I had expected was complicity, and what I found was captivity. Culvin knew. Not all the servants did. Most believed what Emdra believed, that the Velith root was medicine, and the deep gardens were real, and the pilgrims went willingly to a place of peace. The knowledge of what truly happened was kept within a smaller circle, the steward's office, the governor's household, the oldest families of the service caste who had been passing the secret down for generations. Culvin had not been born into that circle. He had forced his way in. After Veth was chosen, after he watched his sister walk into the forest in her green robe with a smile on her face and did not see her come back, he had gone to the steward's office and demanded to know where she had gone. Callus had told him. Not out of kindness, out of pragmatism. A grieving servant asking questions was a liability. A grieving servant who understood the system and was bound by its silence was an asset. The substance in the food was called Velith root. It grew in the deep forest, near a structure that Culvin described but did not understand. It was not a natural plant. It had been cultivated for centuries. Its seeds brought from a place that the service caste's oral history called the Dark Garden, a place of eternal twilight, a place of sharp angles and impossible spaces, and things that moved too quickly to see. Komora, the Velith root, was a Drukhari cultivation, grown in real space but engineered in the laboratories of the Haimonkoli, the flesh crafters of the Dark City. Its purpose was dual. It pacified, and it healed. It repaired damage to human tissue, reversed the effects of aging and injury, restored the body to a condition of optimal health. Not out of kindness, out of husbandry. The Drukhari wanted their tributes healthy. They wanted the flesh whole and responsive. They wanted the nervous system intact, every receptor functioning, every pain pathway clear and open and ready to receive what the homunculi would feed into it. The healing was not a gift, it was preparation. And the Velith root did one more thing, Culvin told me, his voice dropping to a whisper, even though we were alone in the garden and the night was empty around us. It made the fear sweeter. When the pilgrims went through the gate and the Velith root wore off, and the peace shattered and the terror began, the transition from complete calm to absolute horror was so sudden, so total, so violent, that the emotional response it produced was, to the things on the other side, exquisite, a delicacy, a human soul going from paradise to hell in the space of a heartbeat, the full spectrum of emotion compressed into a single, searing instant of comprehension. The Drukhari, Culvin said, did not just want slaves. They wanted a specific quality of slave. They wanted people who had been kept in perfect peace for so long that they had forgotten what fear tasted like, so that when the fear returned, it returned with the accumulated weight of all the peace that had preceded it. That was why the planet was beautiful. That was why the food healed. That was why the sunsets were famous, and the air tasted like flowers, and every bench and fountain and garden path was designed to produce the maximum possible sense of tranquility. It was not for the residents, it was for what came after the residents. Every moment of peace on Volundris was an investment in future suffering, a deposit into an account that would be collected in full, with interest, in the oubliettes of Komorach. I asked Culvin about his evening vigil at the tree line. I asked him who he was mourning. His face collapsed. "My sister," he said, "Veth. She served in the estate across the valley. She was chosen in the last cycle. She was 19. I asked him how many per cycle. He said 12, one selected for each revolution of the planet's major moon, chosen at the monthly ceremonies, held in the governor's estate until the annual tribute night, when all 12 were delivered together through the gate. Every year, 12 people walked into the forest and did not return. The arrangement had been in place for 6 generations, over 200 years, over 2,000 souls. I asked him if he would help me stop it. He looked at me with the eyes of a boy who had been carrying a weight that would crush a grown man, and he said yes. And I believe it was the first genuine choice he had ever been allowed to make. Culvin became my map. He knew the forest the way I knew the interior of a chimera transport, intimately, completely. Every path and clearing and landmark committed to memory through years of walking its edges and grieving for the people who had walked deeper. He could not go to the gate himself. The servants were forbidden, but he could tell me where the paths led, where the carvings began, where the tree line gave way to the deeper growth that the residents were told was a conservation zone. I went into the forest 3 days after Culvin's confession, armed with his directions and my hidden las pistol and the belt knife I had sharpened on the garden wall. I left before dawn, and I moved through the trees the way I had moved through the urban canyons of Hedricon 4, from cover to cover, pausing to listen, to scan, to let my senses build a model of the terrain before committing to the next stretch. The carvings began at approximately the 4-kilometer mark. The first was small, set into the trunk of a tree, a narrow face with tilted eyes and a smile that was not a smile. Eldar features, but not Craftworld. The expression was wrong. Craftworld, Eldar faces, in the few picked captures and briefing materials I had seen, carried an alien beauty that was distant and cold, the beauty of something that considered itself above you. This face was not distant. This face was intimate. This face was looking at you the way a child looks at an insect it is about to pull the wings from. The carvings grew more elaborate the deeper I went. Faces gave way to full figures, elongated forms with too many joints, posed in attitudes of predatory grace. Some were dancing, some were hunting, some were doing things that human anatomy could not replicate and human language could not describe. They were carved with a precision that made the best Imperial sculpture look crude, and they were recent. The edges were sharp. The detail was fresh. Whoever made these came here regularly, and they took their time, and they treated the forest as a gallery for their art. At 15 kilometers, I found the clearing, the webway gate, a spire of material that was neither stone nor metal, covered in spiraling alien script, set on a platform with oval shapes that pulsed with faint violet light. I did not approach it. I observed from the tree line, and I committed every detail to memory, and I retreated, because I had learned what I needed to learn, and because staying longer would have been reckless. On my way back, at the 10-kilometer mark, I found something I had not seen on the way in. A structure, low, angular, half hidden in the undergrowth, made of the same strange material as the webway spire, but darker, almost invisible against the forest floor. It had not been there when I passed this spot on the way in. I was certain of that. I had been cataloging every feature of the terrain with the compulsive attention of a man whose survival depended on knowing where he had been and what was around him. This structure had appeared in the hours between my outward and return journeys, which meant one of two things. Either it had been moved here while I was at the clearing, or it had been here all along but concealed by some technology that I could not detect, and that had, for whatever reason, been deactivated. Neither option was comforting. The structure was a shelter of some kind, a temporary camp or observation post, open on one side like a hunter's blind. Inside, arranged with the meticulous care of a quartermaster's inventory, were objects that made the hair on the back of my neck stand rigid. Blades, thin and dark and impossibly sharp, each one no wider than a finger but long enough to reach the heart from any angle. Vials of liquid that caught no light, that seemed to exist in a state of permanent shadow even when I held them up to the fading daylight. A mask, or perhaps a helm, with a faceplate that curved into points at the jaw and the brow, and that had eye slits so narrow that whatever wore it would see the world as a series of thin, bright lines. The material was warm to the touch, not residual warmth from the sun, a living warmth as though the objects retained some trace of the body that had recently handled them. And on the ground, scattered among the objects like discarded playing pieces, were thorns. Dozens of them, the same black, weightless, light-absorbing thorns that I had found on my garden path. The Drukhari were not just coming for the tribute. They were here, on the planet, in the forest, moving through the trees on nights when the laughter echoed between the trunks, leaving their thorns and their carvings and their watchful, beautiful art, observing their livestock with the patient, proprietary attention of farmers inspecting a herd. The shadows I had seen on my first day, the laughter I had heard on my first night, the thorns on my garden path. They had been watching me since my arrival, perhaps longer. Perhaps they had been watching from the moment my shuttle broke through the clouds and the green of Velundris spread below me like a tablecloth laid for a feast. I backed away from the observation post. I did not touch anything inside it. Touching it would have told them I had been here, and I needed whatever small advantage the element of surprise could give me. But I committed every detail to memory, every object, every position, every dimension of the shelter itself, because information is ammunition, and I was running low on every other kind. I returned to my estate at nightfall. The evening meal was on the table, warm and fragrant. Emdra stood by the kitchen doorway, hands folded, waiting. I did not sit down. I stood in the doorway of the dining room, and I looked at her, and she looked at me. and something in my face must have told her that the man who had left that morning was not the man who had returned, because her composure cracked, just slightly, just enough for me to see the fear underneath. I asked her what was in the food. She did not deny it. That was the thing that surprised me. I had expected deflection, evasion, the practiced ignorance of a person who has been trained to lie. Instead, she straightened her spine and met my eyes and said, with a quiet dignity that I had not expected, "It is called Velith root, Sergeant, and it is keeping you alive." I told her it was a sedative. She shook her head. "Not a sedative," she said. "A medicine. You came here broken. I have served soldiers before. I have watched what happens when they arrive. The screaming in the night, the shaking hands, the way they flinch at bird song because their bodies cannot distinguish between a bird and a weapon being charged. I have watched men sit at that table and weep because the food has flavor and they had forgotten what flavor was. You were dying, Sergeant, not from a wound, from the war inside you. The war that does not stop when the shooting stops. The Velith root quiets that war. It heals the damage that the medici cannot see. Without it, you would not sleep. You would not eat. You would sit in your chair and watch the door until your heart gave out from the strain of waiting for an enemy that is not coming." Her voice did not waver. She believed every word. She believed it the way a Sister Hospitaller believes in the Emperor's mercy, with a conviction so total that questioning it would be like questioning the existence of the ground beneath her feet. She had been raised in this system. Her mother had prepared the Velith root before her, and her mother's mother before that. Generations of women standing in kitchens, grinding the root, measuring the dose, stirring the sauce, serving the meal, and believing with complete sincerity that they were healers, that they were saving the broken men and women who were sent to them, that the Velith root was a gift, not a chain. I wanted to tell her what the Velith root actually was, what it was for, where it came from. I wanted to tell her about the gate and the carvings and the observation post and the things that waited in the dark garden for the livestock to be fattened and calmed and delivered. But I looked at her face and I saw a woman who had been born into a lie so vast and so old that it had become indistinguishable from the truth. And I understood that telling her would not free her. It would break her. And breaking Emdra would not help me stop what was happening. So I sat down, and I ate, and I let the Velith root settle into my blood like a warm hand pressing down on the part of me that wanted to scream. In the morning, I went to see the veterans. I visited each of the 11. I spoke to them privately. I told them what I had found. I was direct. I was specific. I did not soften it. And I watched their faces as the information hit them, and I sorted them the way a sergeant sorts his squad into those who could still fight and those who were lost. Most were lost. The 3-year veterans, Osek and Tolvain and the others who had been eating the food for years, could not hear me. The words reached them but did not penetrate. Their eyes flickered sometimes, a brief tremor of something beneath the surface, and then the surface closed over it like water over a stone, and they smiled and told me about their gardens and their paintings and their sunsets. They were gone. The Velith root had dissolved whatever was left of the soldier in them, and what remained was a shell that looked human and sounded human, but that had been emptied of everything that makes a human being dangerous. 3 responded. Sergeant Pritha Nav, Kelmoran 5th Recon, 4 months on Velundris. Nav was small and quiet and had the unsettling habit of appearing in places without anyone having seen her arrive, a recon specialist to the marrow. When I told her about the Webway Gate, she did not ask questions. She pulled a folded piece of paper from her pocket, a hand-drawn map of the northern continent, and pointed to 3 locations she had already marked. Anomalous sounds, she said. Atmospheric disturbances inconsistent with natural weather patterns, possible concealed structures. She had been mapping the forest's irregularities since her second week. She had not known what they meant, but she had known they meant something. Corporal Detan Horval, Ultavan Ironwall, 8 months. Horval was built like a gun emplacement, broad and heavy and designed for sustained pressure. He spoke in short, direct sentences, the verbal equivalent of suppressive fire. When I explained what the Velith root was doing to the food, he looked at his hands, turned them over, and said, "My back stopped hurting on day 12. Took a bolter fragment in the lumbar on Vastox. 30 years of pain, and it just stopped. I knew it was wrong, I just did not want it to be wrong. It was the most honest thing anyone had said to me since I arrived on Velundris. And Master-at-Arms Gorin Vald, Hethron Void Sentinels, 6 weeks planetside, still sleeping with a kitchen knife under his pillow. Valde was shipborne, raised in the tight corridors and sealed compartments of an Imperial warship, and open sky made him nervous in a way that he tried to hide and failed. He stood with his back to walls. He kept his shoulders hunched, as though expecting a low ceiling that was not there. He had a tick, a rhythmic tapping of his right thumb against his thigh. 3 taps, then a pause, 3 taps, then a pause, which I recognized as the firing cadence of a shipboard point defense turret. When I told him about the Drukhari, he tapped faster for a moment, then stopped and said in a voice that was almost too calm, "Good. Something to shoot at. I have been looking for something to shoot at since I got here." And then there was Fentress. Captain Mola Fentress, who had been here 3 years, who painted landscapes, who had peace in her eyes. I told her everything. I showed her the thorns, I described the gate. And she listened, and she nodded, and she touched my arm with a hand that was steady and warm, and she said, "Sergeant Melek, I hear you. I believe you are in pain, and I am going to help you." I thought she meant she was going to help me fight. I was wrong. What she meant was that she was going to help me the way Velundris had helped her, by making the pain stop, by making the truth go away, by ensuring that the broken, frightened, dangerous man in front of her was returned to the gentle, healing embrace of the food and the peace and the beautiful, merciful lie. I should have seen it. I should have recognized the signs. The Velith root had not merely dulled her instincts, it had replaced them. The woman who had once earned the rank of captain in a drop regiment, who had made split-second decisions under fire that saved the lives of her squad, was now making decisions based on an entirely different set of values. Not survival, not truth, not duty, comfort. The Velith root had rewritten her priorities so completely that she could look at evidence of xenos infiltration and a 6th-generation conspiracy of human sacrifice and see only one thing: a fellow veteran who was struggling to adjust to peace, who needed to be calmed and fed and returned to the program. She was not stupid. She was not weak. She was recalibrated. The drug had taken the soldier out of her and replaced it with something that looked like wisdom, but was really just compliance wearing a more sophisticated mask. Fentress reported me to the governor's steward, Ureth Callis, the same thin, precise man who had presided over the ceremony. She did it that same evening. She did it with the absolute conviction of a woman whose capacity for suspicion had been chemically removed, who believed that I was a threat to the peace that had saved her, that my warnings about the forest and the gate and the Drukhari were the delusions of a traumatized mind that had not yet surrendered to the healing that Velundris offered. She betrayed me to save me. That was the most Velundris thing I had ever heard, and I could not even hate her for it, because the woman who made that decision was not the same woman who had earned the rank of captain in the Vastalan drop troops. That woman was gone. The Veleth root had dissolved her and left behind something kinder and softer and infinitely more dangerous. Callus moved fast. Within a day, I noticed changes. The servants at my estate were replaced. Emdra remained, but Sullus and Reth were gone, and in their places were two new faces, a man and a woman, who smiled just as warmly, but who watched me with eyes that were harder and more attentive than any servant's eyes should have been. Culvin remained too, but he was frightened. I could see it in the way he moved, in the way he avoided my gaze, in the way his hands trembled when he brought me my evening meal. They had spoken to him. They knew he had talked. I had to accelerate. Whatever time I had thought I had, Fentress had cut it in half. The next tribute cycle was 14 days away. If Callus decided I was a problem, I would not last 14 days. I would be added to the tribute myself, or I would simply disappear, another veteran who went on a pilgrimage to the deep gardens. I gathered Nav, Horvale, and Valde at Valda's estate, the most remote of the four, and I told them that we were going to war. The plan had 4 components. First, evidence. We needed proof of the governor's pact that could be transmitted off-world. Horval, whose urban warfare training included infiltration protocols, volunteered to enter the governor's administrative wing and find documentation. Second, communication. The spaceport's landing beacon had a long-range Vox transmitter capable of reaching Imperial military frequencies. Nav, the recon specialist, would assess it. Third, disruption. If we could not get a message out in time, we would prevent the next tribute from being delivered. Fourth, the word we did not say. Survival. Horval moved first. He reached the governor's estate through a service corridor and found what he was looking for in a records room behind the administrative office. Ledgers. Physical ledgers, handwritten in a cipher that his Ultavan cryptographic training cracked in 2 hours. 6 generations of records documenting every tribute delivered through the webway gate to the Drukhari. Names, dates, physical descriptions, notes on health, age, emotional state at the time of collection. He took 3 pages and made it out undetected, but he was seen leaving the grounds by a member of the ceremonial guard, who reported it to Callus. We lost Horval on the 4th day after the meeting. He did not show up at our scheduled contact point. I went to his estate and found it empty. His belongings were there. His food was on the table, half-eaten. The door was open. He was gone. And when I asked the local servants about him, they told me, with the serene vacancy that characterized everyone on this world, that Corporal Horval had decided to go on a pilgrimage to the deep gardens, 3 of us now, and the tribute was 10 days away. Nav reached the spaceport on the 7th day and found the transmitter disabled, not destroyed. A critical circuit board had been removed, cleanly and precisely, as though someone had anticipated that a resident might one day try to send a message. The transmitter was dead. I made a decision that was either brave or stupid, and in my experience, those 2 things are the same thing seen from different angles. I went to see the governor. I brought the ledger pages that Horval had taken, which I had been carrying since his disappearance. I brought my last pistol under my shirt, and I brought a question that had been forming in my mind since Culvin's confession, a question about why the governor maintained a pact he clearly did not enjoy. Because no man wears weariness that heavy unless the weight is personal. Lord Governor Erashin Velethos received me in the same room as before, the same red chair, the same pale blue eyes, the same careful smile. I placed the ledger pages on the table and I said, "I know what you are doing." He looked at the pages. He did not pick them up. He did not need to, and the smile fell away, and beneath it was a face that was older than its years, a face that had been carrying something so heavy for so long that the carrying had become indistinguishable from the face itself. "You do not understand," he said. I told him I understood perfectly. "No," he said, "you understand what is happening. You do not understand why, or what it costs." He told me. He did not justify, he did not excuse. He simply told me the way a man reads a casualty report, clinically, completely. The pact was not his choice. It was not his father's choice. It had been made by the first Velathos to govern Velundris. 6 generations ago, a woman named Sarida Velathos, who had arrived to find the Webway Gate already active and the Drukhari already raiding the indigenous population at will, taking whoever they wanted, whenever they wanted. Sarida did not make a deal to gain something. She made it to stop losing everything. A structured, predictable tribute in exchange for a cessation of random raids. 12 per year instead of hundreds. A controlled loss instead of an uncontrolled one. A garden instead of a slaughterhouse. I asked him what the pact had cost him personally, not the world. Him. He was silent for a long time. Then he walked to a side table and opened a drawer and took out a small holopict, the kind that officers carry in their breast pockets, and he held it out to me. It showed a girl, 10, maybe 11, dark hair, pale blue eyes, identical to his. She was smiling in the way that only children smile, with the complete, uninhibited certainty that the world is not yet capable of doing them harm. "My daughter," he said, "Elandre. She was taken in the 3rd year of my governorship, not as tribute. The cabal of the Shattered Bloom took her as guarantee. Insurance, to ensure that the Velathos line would never break the pact. She is alive. They tell me she is alive. They show me images sometimes when they come through the gate to collect the tribute, images of what she has become, what their Haimokuli have done with her." He stopped, not because he had finished speaking, but because his voice had failed him, the way a machine fails when a critical component gives out. He stood at the window with his back to me, and he breathed, one long, controlled breath. The breath of a man who has practiced not breaking in front of other people, and who is very good at it, but who is reaching the limit of his ability. She was 11 years old, he said, when they took her. She liked to draw. She drew pictures of the garden, the flowers, the sea. She would sit on the terrace outside this very room, and she would draw for hours. And she was not particularly talented, but she was earnest, and the pictures she made were full of color and detail, and the kind of optimism that only a child who has never known suffering can produce. The Cabal took her on the night of my first tribute cycle. They said it was customary, a tradition of the pact, a guarantee that the governor's commitment was personal and not merely political. They said she would be returned if 6 generations of the pact were completed without incident. 6 generations. Do you know how long that is, Sergeant? At the rate my family produces children, that is approximately 800 years. They took an 11-year-old girl, and they told her father that she would be returned in 800 years. And then they smiled. And the smile was the same smile you see on the carvings in the forest, the smile that communicates nothing but the pleasure of watching someone understand something terrible. She would be 34 now. If time passes in that place the way it passes here, I do not know if it does. Some of the images they have shown me suggest that she has aged. Others suggest she has not. I do not know which possibility is worse. He put the pike away. He closed the drawer. When he turned back to me, his face had reset. The governor was back. The mask was on. But the mask was thinner than before, and the thing beneath it was visible now, a grief so vast and so permanent that it had become structural, a load-bearing element of the man's personality, without which the rest of the architecture would collapse. I asked him about Horval. His expression did not change, but something in his posture shifted, the subtle recalibration of a man who has been asked a question he was expecting. "Your friend is alive," he said. "He is being held in the preparation chambers beneath this estate. He will be included in the next tribute. I cannot withdraw him. The Cabal has already been informed." I asked him why he was telling me this, why he was not simply having me arrested, sedated, added to the tribute myself. "Because I am tired," he said, "and because nothing you can do will change what happens next. I have sent messages to the Inquisition, to the Astra Militarum, to the Subsector Command. In 6 generations, not one has received a response. There is something else you should know," he said, "something about why veterans are sent here. You believe you were sent as a reward for your service. The Departamento Munitorum does process settlement applications for distinguished veterans. The paperwork is real, the commendation is real, but the selection is not random." He paused. He seemed to be choosing his words with the care of a man disarming an explosive. "The Cabal has preferences," he said. "They favor certain kinds of people, soldiers specifically. People who have suffered and survived. People with a particular capacity for fear. The Velitheth root suppresses their trauma, but it does not erase it. When the suppression ends, the fear returns all at once, and the Drukhari find this desirable. I do not know the full details of their criteria. They provide a list of qualities. I select from the settlement applications accordingly. I have been doing this for 26 years. My father did it before me, his mother before him." I heard the words. I processed them. The implication arrived not all at once, but in stages. The settlement program was not a reward, it was procurement. The Departamento Munitorum, knowingly or unknowingly, was funneling combat veterans to a world where they would be healed and sedated and fattened, and then, when the time came, fed to the most sadistic species in the galaxy. The commendation, the wax seal, the smooth shuttle ride, the beautiful house, all of it was a supply chain, and I was the product. But even then, standing in that room, hearing those words, I did not understand the full scope of it. I thought I was an accident, a veteran who happened to match the criteria, a piece of cargo that happened to fit the dimensions of the crate. I did not yet know that I had been chosen with far more precision than the governor was willing to admit. That knowledge would come later, from a mouth that was not human, in a voice that was not kind. I was not rewarded. I was ordered, like ammunition, like rations, like any other consumable that the machinery of the Imperium processes without thought or feeling. The governor watched me absorb this. He did not look away. He did not flinch. He had the eyes of a man who had seen this reaction before, in other veterans, in other rooms, and who knew that the reaction changed nothing. "I am giving you a choice," he said. "Stay, eat, forget. Live whatever years remain to you in peace, or fight and die and accomplish nothing, because I have sent messages to the Inquisition, to the Astra Militarum, to the Subsector Command, and in 6 generations not one has received a response. Either they never arrived, or they arrived and the Imperium made the same calculation I make every year. 12 lives for a stable world that produces no trouble. The arithmetic works, Sergeant. It has always worked. It works for the Imperium. It works for the Cabal. It works for everyone except the 12. I left without answering him. I walked out of the estate and down the cliff road, past the terraces and the gardens, and I saw none of it. The beauty was invisible to me now. It was wallpaper over a charnel house, decoration over damnation. On the way back, still moving in a haze of rage and despair, I passed the barracks of the ceremonial guard, a long, low building of white stone with a courtyard visible through an arched gateway. The guards themselves were inside, their gilded armor visible through the windows, polished and pristine and useless. But behind the barracks, in a separate structure that might once have been a vehicle bay, I saw something that pulled me off the road and through the courtyard, as though I had been hooked. A sentinel. A standard pattern armored sentinel, the kind that the Gravean 47th used as forward reconnaissance and fire support. It was old, the paint was faded, and the markings were from a regiment I did not recognize. It was clearly a display piece, a museum exhibit, one of those military relics that peaceful worlds keep as decorations to remind visitors that the Imperium is somewhere far away, still at war. It stood in the vehicle bay with its legs locked in walking position and its hull open to the elements, and it had probably not moved in decades. But I was Gravean 47th Armored Infantry. I had spent 3 decades inside machines like this. I had maintained them, repaired them, coaxed them back to life in the field with salvaged parts and profanity and prayers to the Omnissiah that I only half believed. I knew sentinels the way a surgeon knows anatomy, and this one, beneath the dust and the neglect, was intact. The power plant was a standard Mars pattern unit. The drive mechanisms were corroded but not seized. The weapon mount was empty, but the mount itself was functional. I did not take it. Not yet. But I marked its location and I calculated what I would need to make it operational, and the list was short. And most of what I needed was already in the vehicle bay, in the form of maintenance tools and lubricants and spare components that had been stored alongside the Sentinel as part of the display and never removed. I went back to Valday's estate. I told Nav and Valday what I had learned. All of it. The procurement program, the governor's daughter, the Cabal's preferences, the transmitter, Horvale. I told them that the situation was worse than we had thought, and that the odds were longer, and that the chance of success was, by any honest assessment, effectively 0. And then I told them about the Sentinel. Nav looked at me for a long time. She was a recon specialist. She had spent her career calculating risks, measuring distances, assessing probabilities. She knew what I was proposing was not a viable military operation. It was a gesture, a statement, an act of defiance that had no realistic chance of changing anything, but that would, at the very least, show the Drukhari that not everyone on their farm went quietly. She said, "I did not survive 22 years of the Emperor's wars to die in a garden. If I am going to die, I would rather die loud." Valday said nothing. He simply picked up his kitchen knife and began sharpening it on the stone of the fireplace. We had 6 days. We spent them preparing. Culvin helped. He helped because of Veth, because of the sister who had gone through the gate at 19, and because for the first time in his life someone was asking him to fight instead of serve. He moved between the estates and the barracks with the invisible efficiency of a servant, carrying tools and parts and messages, drawing no attention because servants drew no attention on Volundris. That was the irony. The system that made the servants invisible to the residents also made them invisible to the governor's watchers. Culvin was the most effective intelligence operative I had ever worked with, and his only training was a lifetime of being overlooked. I spent 4 nights in the vehicle bay, working on the Sentinel by the light of a hand lamp, reconditioning the drive mechanisms, flushing the corroded fuel lines, coaxing the ancient power plant through its ignition sequence until it caught and held, and the machine shuddered to life with a sound that I felt in my bones. The sound of an engine, the sound of a war machine, the sound of home. There is something that civilians do not understand about the relationship between a mechanized soldier and his vehicle. It is not affection exactly, it is not sentimentality. It is the knowledge, earned through years of shared survival, that the machine is an extension of you, that your nervous system does not end at your fingertips, but continues through the control levers and the pedal assemblies and the hull plating, that when the machine takes a hit, you feel it, and when the machine moves well, you move well. I had spent more of my life inside Sentinels and Chimeras than I had spent in any building. Every one I had ever piloted had a personality, a set of quirks and mechanical idiosyncrasies that made it different from every other unit in the regiment. This one was old and tired and had been standing in a shed for decades, but when the power plant caught and the instruments flickered to life and the cockpit filled with the familiar smell of lubricant and heated metal, I was home for the first time since I had left Gravean. The weapon mount was empty, but I improvised. A length of industrial pipe from the barracks plumbing system, packed with fuel siphoned from the Sentinel's reserve tank and sealed with rags. It was not a Lascanin, it was barely a weapon. But it would burn, and sometimes burning is enough. On the 5th night of preparations, Culvin came to the vehicle bay with something he had taken from the governor's estate. A schedule. The tribute schedule, handwritten in the same cipher that Horval had cracked, listing the date, the time, and the precise sequence of events that accompanied each collection. The gate opened at the 3rd hour past midnight. The tributes were assembled on the platform 1 hour before. The Drukhari emerged, inspected, collected, and departed within 30 minutes. The process was mechanical, predictable. The same sequence every cycle for 200 years. Predictability is the enemy of the ambush. It is also its best friend. Because when you know exactly when and where and how the enemy will move, you can position yourself in the one place they do not expect. And the Drukhari, for all their intelligence and their cruelty and their millennia of raiding experience, did not expect resistance at Velundris. They had never encountered it. The Velith route ensured that. The Pact ensured that. For 200 years, the tributes had walked to the clearing willingly, and the Drukhari had collected them without opposition. They had become comfortable, and comfort, as any soldier knows, is the precursor to vulnerability. I did not intend to win. I need to be clear about that. 3 old veterans, a servant boy, and a salvaged sentinel against Kabbalite warriors from a cabal that had been conducting slave raids since before the Imperium existed. The mathematics were not in our favor. But mathematics is a tool for planning, not for deciding. The decision to fight was not a calculation. It was a refusal to be processed, a refusal to walk into the dark willingly, the way every other tribute had walked for 200 years, calm and peaceful and already gone. If I was going to the dark city, I was going loud. On the night of the tribute, we moved. Culvin led us through the forest by a route he had memorized from a lifetime of walking its edges. Not the main paths, not the routes the residents used. The servants' paths, narrow trails through the undergrowth that wound between the trees in patterns that made no sense unless you knew they had been designed to avoid the places where the Drukhari left their carvings and their thorns and their watchful, beautiful art. Culvin moved without thought, without hesitation. Every turn and every step an act of embedded knowledge, the way a prayer becomes embedded in the mouth of a man who has spoken it 10,000 times. The sentinel walked behind us. I was in the cockpit, hunched over the controls, the familiar embrace of the walker's frame around me like the rib cage of an old friend. The machine moved with the heavy, deliberate gait of its kind, each step a controlled fall, the gyro stabilizers compensating for the uneven ground. It was loud. There was no hiding a sentinel, but I was done hiding. We were all done hiding. The clearing was lit by the webway gate. The spire blazed with cold white light, every character of its alien script burning like phosphor against the dark material. The oval shapes on the platform were open, wide, and violet, casting beams of light upward into the sky like searchlights. The air hummed with a vibration that set my teeth on edge and made the Sentinel's instrument panel flicker. The small objects that ringed the perimeter, the thorn clusters and wire knots and two sharp flowers, were pulsing in synchrony with the spire, each one glowing faintly, and I understood now that they were not decorations. They were components, parts of a machine. The entire clearing was a machine, the spire and the platform and the pulsing eyes and the ring of alien artifacts, all of it working together to tear a hole in the fabric of reality, to open a door between this world and the one that waited on the other side. The tributes were already there. 12 figures in green robes standing on the platform in a loose circle, their faces blank and serene. They had walked here willingly. They had dressed in their ceremonial robes, and they had followed the path through the forest, and they had stepped onto the platform, and they had stood in their circle, and not one of them had asked where they were going, because the Velith route had taken the question away from them along with every other instinct that might have told them to run. They looked peaceful. They looked content. They looked like people who were about to do something wonderful, and the gap between what they believed and what was about to happen to them was so vast that looking at them made my chest hurt with a physical pain that had nothing to do with old injuries. Among them, taller than the rest, was Horval. His eyes were open but vacant. The Velith route had taken everything. He did not see me. He did not see anything. He stood in his green robe with his hands at his sides and his face empty, and this was a man who had held a street intersection against a chaos warband for 6 hours with nothing but a combat knife and a looted auto gun, and now he was standing on a xenos platform waiting to be collected like a parcel, and he did not even know it. And the gate was opening. It happened in silence, a line in the air, a crack in reality, darkness behind it, not empty but full, a darkness that had weight and texture and intent. The line widened, became a tear, and through the tear I could see Komorok, the dark angles, the impossible architecture, the sourceless bruised light, and shapes moving within it, shapes that were already emerging, already stepping through, already here. 6 Kabbalite warriors. They moved like liquid through the tear, their dark segmented armor catching no light, their weapons held with the casual readiness of predators who had never encountered resistance and did not expect to encounter it now. They were led by a figure that was taller than the rest, helmed, crested with backward curving blades. A Draken, a lieutenant of the Cabal of the Shattered Bloom, come to collect the evening's harvest. The Draken surveyed the tributes with a glance that lasted less than a second. Then it turned slowly and looked at the tree line, and it saw us. It saw the Sentinel, and for a moment, just a moment, it stopped. Not in fear, in interest, the way a collector pauses when they discover a piece they had not expected to find. I fired. The improvised weapon on the Sentinel's mount discharged with a roar that split the silence of the clearing like a bolt shell through glass. A gout of flame erupted from the pipe and streaked across the clearing toward the Drukhari formation, and for one bright, defiant, incandescent second, the night was full of fire. The blast caught the nearest warrior and engulfed it, and the sound it made was not a scream but something else, something high and musical and terrible, and I did not care what it was because I was already moving, driving the Sentinel forward into the clearing, its heavy feet churning the grass, its frame swaying with the momentum. Nav was beside me, moving low and fast, her kitchen knife in one hand and a torch she had made from a branch and fuel-soaked rags in the other. Valder was on the other flank, his pipe raised. Culvin was behind, unarmed, because I had told him his job was not to fight, but to reach Horval and the other tributes and pull them off the platform before the gate closed, or before they were taken through. The fight lasted less than 2 minutes. I think. I am not certain because I tried to count and I lost the count, and I have never lost the count, not in 31 years, not on Meridax when the Orc war boss tore through our line, not on Hedricon 4 when the ammunition ran out and we fought with entrenching tools, not once. You count in combat. You count seconds between shots, rounds in your magazine, heartbeats between breaths. It is the only way to stay anchored. And in the clearing, in the light of the webway gate, with the Drukhari moving through the darkness around me, I lost the anchor. Because they did not move the way anything I had ever fought moved. Orcs are fast but predictable. They come straight at you, bellowing, and your body learns the rhythm, and your hands track the target, and the lasbolt goes where it needs to go. Tyranids are alien but comprehensible, a tide of chitin and claws that you can read like terrain, identifying the gaps, the choke points, the places where the swarm thins. Even chaos, for all its madness, follows patterns that a trained eye can decode. The Drukhari followed no pattern. They were everywhere and nowhere. My instincts said left and I turned left, and the space was empty. And then pain bloomed across my right shoulder where something had sliced through my shirt and drawn a line of blood so fine I did not feel the cut until I saw the red. My instincts said down, and I dropped, and a blade passed through the space where my throat had been. And I thought I had been fast. I thought a lifetime of combat reflexes had saved me. And then I realized the blade had missed because it was meant to miss. Because the thing that swung it wanted me to feel clever for half a second before it showed me how slow I truly was. The first warrior I had hit with the Sentinel's improvised flamer was already standing. Its armor was scorched but intact, and it was walking toward me with the unhurried gait of something that has never needed to hurry. I swung the Sentinel's right leg in a kick that would have crushed a chimera's hull. The warrior was not there. It had not dodged. It had not sidestepped. It had simply stopped being in the place where my foot was going and started being somewhere else, as though space itself had rearranged at its request. Then the Sentinel's knee joint detonated from a strike I never saw, and the machine pitched forward, and the ground came up to meet me, and everything I knew about warfare became irrelevant. I bailed from the cockpit, came up on my feet, las pistol in hand. I fired at motion, at shapes, at the places where my eyes said targets should be, and the targets were never there. 3 shots, 4, 5. Scorch marks on the grass, on the platform, on the trunk of a tree 20 meters away. I was hitting everything except the things I was shooting at, and they were not even trying to avoid me. They were letting me miss. They were watching me miss the way you watch an animal run in circles inside a pen with a detached, clinical interest that was worse than contempt, because contempt at least implies you are worth the emotion. Nav moved in the chaos like a ghost. She appeared behind a warrior that was focused on Valde, low and fast, her knife finding the gap between the shoulder plates with the precision of a woman who had spent 22 years studying how things were put together so she could take them apart. Dark blood splashed. The warrior staggered, and for one heartbeat I thought, we can hurt them. They bleed. They can be hurt. Then something punched through the darkness behind Nav, a splinter no thicker than a needle, and it hit her in the base of the spine, and she fell like a puppet cut from its strings. She did not cry out. Her body simply stopped responding. She lay face down in the grass with her eyes open and her knife still in her hand, and the warrior she had stabbed looked down at her with the expression of someone who has been bitten by an insect and finds it mildly noteworthy. Valde was fighting with the controlled fury of a man born in the corridors of a warship, every swing tight, every strike aimed at joints and gaps, his pipe cracking against armor with the firing cadence of a point defense turret. 3 strikes, then a pivot. 3 strikes, then a pivot. He was good. He was very good. And it made no difference at all. The Draken moved once, a single fluid motion that my eyes could not track, and Valde's pipe was gone from his hands, and Valde was on the ground making a sound that was not a word and would never be a word again. Culvin ran, not away, through. He sprinted across the clearing toward the platform where the tributes stood in their green robes with their empty, peaceful faces, and he reached Horvale, and he put his hands on his shoulders, and he looked into the drugged, vacant eyes, and he said his sister's name, not to Horval, to the gate, to the darkness beyond it, as though by saying Veth's name into the mouth of that place, he could reach her, pull her back, undo what had been done. The Draken was beside him before the name had finished leaving his mouth. One long-fingered hand closed around Culvin's arm and lifted him off his feet as though he weighed nothing. And Culvin did not scream. He looked at the Draken with the face of a boy who had spent a year mourning at the tree line and who was finally seeing the thing that had taken everything from him. And the Draken looked back with tilted violet eyes, and something passed between them that was not language, but that both understood. Then the wave hit me. Not a blade, not a splinter. Something that started at the base of my skull and cascaded through every nerve I had, and my body locked rigid, every muscle frozen, every joint sealed. I fell the way buildings fall, straight down, and the grass caught me, and the grass was soft, and the sky was above me, and the sky was full of stars, and I could not move. The Draken walked to me. It knelt beside me, and the helm retracted, folding back like the petals of a mechanical flower, and I saw the face from the carvings, long, narrow, tilted eyes, an expression that defied translation but that communicated with absolute clarity that I was the most interesting thing it had seen in a very long time. It spoke, low Gothic, accented, alien, shaped by a mouth that had been speaking it for longer than most human civilizations had existed. "You fought," it said. It sounded pleased. That happens less often than you would think. Usually they walk through willingly. The peace makes them docile. Generations of your kind have stepped onto this platform with smiles on their faces, and we have taken them, and they did not begin to understand until it was far too late. And even then the understanding was slow, muted, dulled by the residue of the Velith in their blood. But you... It tilted its head, the violet eyes moved across my face, reading me the way I had read terrain for my entire career. You resisted the Velith, you found the gate, you brought a war machine, you fought with tools made of plumbing and kitchen implements. It paused, and the smile that crossed its face was the smile from the carvings, the smile that showed too many teeth and communicated nothing that could be called happiness. We knew you would. We requested you specifically. The words hit me harder than the paralysis. Requested. Specifically. Your name was on a list before you left your homeworld, Sergeant. We have observers in places your kind does not think to look. Your service record was evaluated by members of my cabal long before the Unnatural processed your settlement papers. 31 years of combat, tyrannids, orcs, sieges, urban warfare, psychological trauma markers consistent with what our flesh crafters call a deep well, a reservoir of suffering so compressed by years of chemical suppression and forced functionality that when it is finally released, when the layers of coping and control and military discipline are stripped away, the psychic yield is extraordinary. You are not a retired soldier, Sergeant. You are a vintage, a specific product cultivated for a specific palate, the commendation, the wax seal, the smooth shuttle ride. All of it was the label on the bottle. It stood. It made a gesture to the other warriors, a wave of one long-fingered hand, casual, economical, and the warriors moved among us, collecting us the way the servants of Velundris collected the plates after dinner, efficiently, without haste. The cruelty was not here. The cruelty was not a thing to be wasted on a forest clearing under a bright moon. The cruelty was an art, and art requires the proper setting, the proper tools, the proper audience. What was happening now was simply logistics, transport, the movement of material from the point of production to the point of consumption. The last thing I saw on Velundris was the sky. They carried us to the platform, the 4 of us and the 12 tributes, arranged on the smooth alien surface like offerings on an altar. The gate pulsed above us, the tear in reality widening with each pulse, and through it came a darkness that was not the darkness of night or the darkness of space, but something else, a darkness that had depth and texture and intent, a darkness that was looking at me. Culvin was beside me, his arm still held by the Drakon, his face wet, but his eyes steady. He was looking at the gate, not with fear, with something else. He was looking at it the way you look at a door that you know your sister is behind. Nav was being carried by 2 warriors, paralyzed like me, her eyes open and fixed and full of a fury so intense it was almost beautiful. She could not move, she could not speak, but she could hate, and she was hating with every fiber of her being, and I like to think that somewhere in the alien sensorium of the things that held her, they could feel it, and I like to think it tasted like ash. Valde was unconscious. His breathing was shallow. Blood from his side wound had soaked through his shirt and was dripping onto the platform, and each drop that hit the alien surface was absorbed instantly, drawn into the material the way water is drawn into sand, as though the platform itself was drinking him. Horval stood among the tributes, his eyes empty, his mind somewhere the Velith root had taken it, somewhere safe and warm and false. He did not know what was happening to him. He would not know until the drug wore off, and when it wore off, he would be somewhere else, and the knowing would come all at once, and it would come with the accumulated weight of all the peace that had preceded it. The Draken turned to the gate. It raised one hand, a gesture of command or invitation or ownership, and the darkness beyond the tier shifted, and I could see something moving in it, something vast and angular and alive, and I could hear something that was not sound, but that my ears translated into sound, because they had no other way to process it, a low, resonant vibration that was the voice of a city, or the heartbeat of a city, or the hunger of a city, and it was waiting for us. The sky above me was doing the thing that Velundris skies do. Even at the 3rd hour past midnight, the atmosphere held a faint luminescence, amber at the edges fading to deep indigo at the zenith. It was the most beautiful sky I had ever seen, and I understood, finally, why. The beauty was not for us. It was bait. Every sunset, every healed scar, every moment of peace on this world existed for one purpose: to make what came next worse. The gate opened fully, the darkness reached through, and I felt the platform beneath me begin to move, or the space around the platform begin to fold, or reality itself begin to tear like wet paper. And the sky, my sky, the last sky, the beautiful lying sky of Velundris, began to shrink, collapsing inward like a closing eye, the stars disappearing one by one as the edges of the tear drew together over me. I tried to speak. The paralysis held my jaw shut. I tried to move. My body was stone. I tried to close my eyes, to choose the last thing I saw, to keep the sky or reject it, to make one final decision in a life that had been defined by decisions made under fire. But even that choice was taken from me. My eyes were open, and they would not close, and the last thing I saw was not the sky and not the darkness, but the place where they met, the thin line between the two, the border between the world I knew and the world I was going to, and in that thin line there was nothing. No color, no light, no darkness, nothing at all. And then Volundrus was gone, and I was somewhere else, and the somewhere else was vast and dark and alive and hungry, and the first sound I heard was laughter. Not the laughter of a human voice, something higher, something with more notes in it than a human throat could produce. The same laughter I had heard from the forest on my first night on Volundrus, cascading, crystalline, rising and falling like water over stones. They had been laughing at me from the beginning. My name is Torvin Melak, Sergeant, Gravean 47th Armored Infantry, 3rd Battalion, Chimera Company. Whatever comes next, my name is mine. It is the only thing left that they cannot take. If you are hearing this, know one thing. If they ever offer you paradise, do not go. And somewhere on a world I will never see again, the sun is setting, and the sky is amber and coral and rose. And at an estate on the northern continent, a table is set for one with porcelain that gleams in the evening light. The chair is empty. The food is growing cold. The sauce in its small ceramic dish is the same amber color as the sky, warm and herbal and sweet, and it will not be eaten tonight, because the man who sat in this chair is gone, and Emdra does not know where. And she stands in the kitchen doorway with her hands folded, and she waits, and then she stops waiting, and she walks to the table, and she picks up the plate, and the porcelain clinks against her ring as she lifts it, a small, bright sound in the quiet of the empty house. She carries the plate back to the kitchen. She scrapes the food into the waste. She washes the plate and dries it and places it back on the shelf. And tomorrow she will set the table again, and the day after that, and the day after that. Because that is what she does, because that is what her mother did, because the garden must be maintained, and the food must be prepared, and the house must be kept ready for whoever comes next. And through the open window the breeze carries the scent of flowers and warm rain, and something sweet, and from the forest, very faintly, so faintly that a person who was not listening would never hear it, there is laughter.